Hello friends, welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to be talking about this full moon coming up on the 10th, which definitely deserves discussion. I don't know how many people have looked ahead to see if they could suss out what's coming up in this full moon, but the fact that the full moon makes a T-square to Pluto is really significant. Basically, we've been talking quite a bit about the Uranus-Eris conjunction in not late Aries, but 21, 22, 23 degrees of Aries, around there. Been active since the summer. And so this Uranus-Eris conjunction in Aries has been also square to Pluto, which is part of the Uranus-Pluto square of this decade. And that's been an important factor in this whole thing. Radical transformation is coming down upon all of us and upon the culture in general, and we can see it by just looking around. And then this particular full moon is at 21 degrees of Aries and of the opposite sign of Libra, the moon being at 21 degrees of Libra. So this is right on the axis of the Uranus conjunction, which is widening now. Uranus is moving beyond Eris. But and also Jupiter is still opposed by 4 degrees to the full moon itself. So it's a very powerful configuration. So if anybody's just joining us, we're going to be talking about this full moon that's coming up on April 10th. And I've been saying just how powerful this full moon is. And let's go ahead and look at the chart, and then we can get an even better idea of how strong it is. So the chart should be up. You should be able to see the chart on your screens. And so this is what we're looking at. We're looking at, here's the sun at 21 degrees of Aries opposed to the moon. And here is Eris at 23 degrees, Uranus at 24 now, Jupiter at 17, and then the full moon itself at 21 degrees of Libra. So this is very dramatic, T-square, really close degrees to Pluto, Pluto being at 19. So basically, the in-between degree of 21 and 17. So basically, the midpoint of this Jupiter moon being right at 19 degrees, you see, is perfectly square to Pluto and also square to the sun in this full moon configuration. So that's a very powerful indication. That is transformation coming down upon us. Pluto is about death and rebirth. Some part of you is dying, some part of you is being reborn. And of course, the thing to do is not to focus on the difficulties, the disasters, the indications that things are falling away, whatever it might be that's changing in your life. But the thing to do is to focus on the new birth. What is asking to be born? What is coming into being at this time for you? Now the thing is, we also have to keep in mind that Saturn is a very strong component of all this. Saturn is located very close to the 0 degree mark of Capricorn. It is retrograding now, so it's moving away from that point. Well, with 27 degrees of Sag, Saturn is actually being triggered in a square formation by retrograde Venus, which is at its degree that it's retrograding. Retrogrades at 26 degrees, 55 minutes, so it has another just 20 minutes to go, another 5 days to go. So basically, Venus is going to station direct on the 15th of April, and it's sitting here coincidentally on the same degree as Chiron in the sky, and that's all square to Saturn, located, near the 0 point, near the Capricorn point. You could say the winter solstice point. And then, meanwhile, we have also the trine that Saturn makes to Uranus. Uranus is getting a little bit further now into the last degrees of Aries. And if you remember, at the new moon time, Mercury was sitting here. So Mercury was also triggering Saturn by trine at the timing of the new moon, which is, after all, the new moon that precedes this full moon. In other words, this full moon, we want to recognize as well what was happening leading up to it, in terms of the fact that the new moon initiates the cycle. So we have a very powerful Saturn in this configuration, by virtue of the fact that it was part of the new moon, and by virtue of the fact that it is still triggered very extremely by retrograde Venus stationing at this 27 degree mark, which makes a perfect square. So these are very, very tough times. In other words, what happens when Saturn is involved, and Saturn is also parallel to Pluto. Remember, we've been talking about that. So we can track that a little bit. It's closer now. So if we right-click on Saturn using the time passages software, it's kind of easy to see where the patterns are in these parallels. And we see Saturn is parallel to Pluto, 22.1 versus 21.1. So it's actually not that much closer than it was before. It's about a degree. As it retrogrades, it moves back down again, so it will be getting closer to Pluto in the weeks ahead, which is something to bear in mind. It's moving towards the parallel. The declinational degree is moving back towards the Pluto degree. So it's a forming parallel of a 1 degree. And this is something to keep in mind, because Saturn-Pluto is referenced as a difficult time. This is a time when the structure is changing, and when the Pluto empowerment of the Saturn means that there is a conservative backlash to some extent. There's a feeling of, oh no, you won't. You're between the rock and the hard place. I guess it's hard to say which Saturn is, the rock or the hard place. But let's say that the rock is rocking ahead, trying to make something happen and change happen, and then Saturn is saying no. You can't change that fast. This is impractical. This is wildly improbable. We can't go there. We have to pull back. We have to be careful. We have to be holding steady. We have to stay in our rut is another way to look at it. So on an individual level, seeing Saturn empowered in this time of great Uranus-Pluto change means that there is a polarization. There are forces opposed to each other. And you can see this, of course, everywhere you look in the culture. You can see that there is conservative movements in many countries right now trying to say, let's keep our borders solid, let's build walls, let's not let anybody in, let's not let change in, basically, let's keep the status quo. And then there's liberal forces saying, let's move forward, let's do things in a different way, let's see if we can embody some of the values of the 60s and try to have something that's more fair and equal for everybody. Let's try to have values that are spiritual values that transcend the materialistic values of our culture. On the other hand, you do have Saturn saying materialism is just fine. That's the way to go. Business as usual. Hold the fort. That's in the culture. What about in our individual lives? How can we take that lesson and apply it to where we may not necessarily be able to look? You don't always see what's going on with you. It's not always easy to see your own shadow, to see, as they say, no man can see the pack on his own back. Well, there are forces within you that are urging change, and it does involve dropping something that is part of you, that is an established habit pattern, perhaps, something that you feel like you can't let go of because it's so familiar, and yet push comes to shove, and somehow you do have to. And they say that if a problem is serious enough and the problem is ignored, don't worry, it'll keep going, it'll come back, it'll repeat itself, and sure enough, the problem will get worse, in other words. And that is a message that tells you that things do have to change, and the sooner you recognize it, the better. So, Pluto transits are hard, as they say, but not necessarily. Pluto transits are difficult to the extent that we resist them. And of course, this is the resistance, the Saturn, this powerful presence of Saturn. So, if you want to take a tip and you want to try to have an easier time with Pluto, listen. You have to tune into your own inner self. Your intuition is strong right now. Uranus represents intuition. Uranus has been very powerful in the sky since last summer. Your body is telling you things. Your intuition is telling you things that if you tune into it and pay attention and you see, well, this really is where this is going, isn't it? You can avoid some of the suffering of resisting the change that is, after all, typically an inevitable change. This is something that's happening for you. So you need to wake up to that, to whatever extent that might be true. And it is true to the extent that you haven't been current with yourself. So if you've been following your changes and evolving with your changes and moving forward and staying balanced, staying on that surfboard with the currents, staying balanced and seeing what comes, then you're in much better shape than if you've been kind of stuck in a rut. If you're stuck in a rut, maybe it's time to break out, consider blasting out sideways. And another thing that we want to mention when we're just looking at the numbers here and the configurations, how powerful is this full moon? Well, we also have the presence of Mars sitting here at 22 degrees. So 22 degrees, very close to 21, 23. Uranus, not Uranus, but Eris and the Sun are at 21, 23. So that is also triggering this entire T-square configuration to Pluto. I'd like to say just a little bit more about Venus retrograde, and then maybe we'll open it up to questions. So Venus is going to be stationing at 26 degrees, 55 minutes, and at that time, Chiron moves a little bit ahead. So we're talking about Venus and Chiron in very close conjunction as Venus stations over these next 10 days, as 5 days until the station and then a few more days to get going again. So we have a long, long time of Venus being in square with Saturn and Venus being conjunct Chiron. Now this is very serious stuff. This means that as we were talking about the difficulties that you may be encountering with change, with accepting the fact that change is present in your life, Chiron is right there, indicating that perhaps it could be a painful transition in some cases. Chiron is also a great teacher. Chiron can't be thought of as something terrible, just like any of the outer planets. You can't think of this as something terrible, only a downside. There's always an upside. And the upside is getting in better touch with yourself at inner levels. And this is all happening in Pisces, of course, with Neptune emphasized as well in this new moon configuration that preceded the full moon that we're talking about here. So basically, the presence of Chiron, very powerful presence of Chiron in this entire monthly cycle is a powerful one, and means that we can be sure that there are rewards to be gained by tuning in to what's inside ourselves. That's a real key, that's a real clue, because there's so much going on below the surface that we're not aware of within ourselves. And the more we can be in touch with that, the more we can be in touch with old pain, old wounding, which Chiron specializes in. It really represents early wounding for the most part. And how we can work through that, and how we can then have the compassion to be healers in the present moment. So it does give us the depth. There's an old line from an old song, without a heart is hollow. And that's very true. Chiron represents the treasure, really, of recognizing flaws within us, which is a great treasure, because then we can see ourselves whole, we can see ourselves more integrated. So there's a lot of depth work that is very active for us right now, and that I believe this is the key. In fact, Chiron, the symbol looks like a key if you look at it closely. I believe that this Chiron Venus is a key to getting through this difficult time of transition that is represented by this entire monthly cycle, and especially by the timing of this full moon that's coming up on Monday night. So that is mostly what I wanted to say about this configuration. I'm sure people might have questions or comments about it. And I know we have questions, don't we, Leslie? So, yeah, let's let's see what we can come up with as far as questions.
Okay. Great. We can start with a question from Paula. She asks a really good question. I like this one. I was wondering if you could talk about the Saturn conjunction to the galactic center and the impact of it stationing directly on the 27th degree of Sagittarius for such a long time. I have my ascendant and Mars conjunct the galactic center myself, so I'm very interested in finding out more about how this affects us.
Wow, that's a great question. That is not something that I brought up when I was bringing up the Saturn, but that is another indication of strong Saturn. Now let's reflect collectively for a minute on what this means. The galactic center, the actual direction from the geocentric standpoint of the galaxy taken as a whole. In other words, if we take the mass of the galaxy we're sitting on the edge of, the Milky Way galaxy, and if we look at that mass of stars, the center is around 27 degrees of Sag from where we sit. And sure enough, Saturn has been stationing right there just a few days ago at the galactic center, 27 degrees of Sag. It does bring a more cosmic viewpoint to this. I mean, one way we can look at this is we can say, Holy Saturn. You know, we can basically say, let us recognize, please, that Saturn is not just our enemy. In other words, when we run into difficulties, we run into obstacles, we're always cursing the lack of speed. And maybe it's time to recognize that that's a positive. You know, let's praise the lack of speed. In other words, the water in an irrigation ditch has to flow slowly for the water to be absorbed. If the water moves too fast, it doesn't enter the soil and nothing happens. You know, so it's important to recognize that we need to repeat our lessons to get them right. We need to sometimes run into an obstacle 3 times before we get through it, and in the course of that, though, we build character. In the course of that, we learn the lesson of this particular time. We don't learn quickly necessarily. Sometimes there can be an epiphany, which Uranus specializes in the quickness, right? The epiphany. But Saturn specializes in the slow growth that happens when we combine the visionary impulse represented by more cosmic forces with the physical, which is where we live. We're here for a reason. We're here in our physical bodies for a reason. And, you know, it's possible to get all spiritual and to go beyond where we really are and to float ahead of ourselves and to ignore the body, ignore the ego, just get into this holy spiritual place of perhaps LSD vision. I mean, I'm not talking about specific drug. I'm just trying to characterize a way of floating away from ourselves. Saturn pulls us back into ourselves. And why are we here? Why are we here on Earth? Why are we doing these lessons instead of floating amidst the stars? And the reason is because we're here to learn. And we're here to physically embody what is only an idea until we work it out in the physical. So it's important to remember that we have bodies, important to remember that we have egos, and we have to understand that and please our egos as well. So we're here in a variety of ways, and we have to constantly mediate between those outer forces and those inner forces. And by combining the idea of Saturn with the idea of the galactic center, that is exactly what that represents. So it's just another, to me, it's another indication of how powerful these times are, that Saturn has just stationed on the galactic center. So great question. I'm glad that was brought up.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. We have another question from Evie, who's here with us live. I hope I'm saying your name right, Evie, or Evie. She asks, the tumultuous teens are almost over for us. Has the next decade already been named? And if so, what might that be?
Well, I would first like to challenge the assumption that the tumultuous teens, what do I usually call them? Don't I have another word for it? The difficult teens. I don't think I call them the tumultuous teens. I call them something else. But anyway, I don't feel like this decade is over. I feel like the real heart of it is still to come, even though we have seen all of the exact hits of the Uranus-Pluto leading up to this time. The last one being in 2012. Oh, wait a minute, 2015, I guess it was. Is that right? Can't
And the
remember.
last exact hit was?
Yeah.
I think it was last year, 2016.
No, the last hit was 2015, I
Was
think.
it?
Yeah, it wasn't last year. Anyway, so Uranus-Pluto is not over, even though we've had the last exact hits. And I think leading up to 2020 is really a powerful time. I mean, this is the crux of the situation. Can we take the ideals of the 60s and bring them forward into this decade? Is the question. And are they viable? I mean, again, with the physical and Saturn, is it something that can exist in the real world? Can we take those values and see a better world emerging and somehow merge it into the situation that we have with competition and violence and greed that's so prevalent everywhere? So I feel like this decade of the teens is a very powerful decade, a very pivotal decade. And, I'm not really ready to look ahead, to tell you the truth. I feel like this decade is far from over, and it is the crux of our situation. And when we get to 2020, the question remains, are we going to be in a very difficult draconian police state lockdown, or are we going to be in a more expansive state because of the strength of our individual wills, each and every one of us, to forge a new world into being? And then we'll see what the 20s will emerge. It's an open question to me, how the 20s will unfold. Will the 20s unfold in a paradise on earth, which is certainly possible, a gesture away? Or will the 20s unfold in a more difficult fashion? So we'll probably have to see what the 20s are going to be like when they come. It's not always completely determinable by looking at the astrological indications. You can look at the astrology and it gives you signs and it tells you when the more difficult times are, but it doesn't really tell you how it's going to come out. That's up to each individual, working together, all of us together, to see how that will come out. So that's a kind of a ricochet slide ball answer to your question, but there you go.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Next question is from Charlotte. She asks, in interpreting the lunar nodes for married couples, is it more helpful to use a synastry or a composite chart? Please explain.
Well, the lunar nodes for couples. So I think the composite chart is very useful. Both of those techniques would yield different results, and they're both important. So looking at a composite chart, first of all, what would the composite lunar node tell you? It would tell you, looking at this relationship as though it was a third entity, the entity of the team itself, the relationship itself, how that unfolds over time, how that suffers or prospers over time. You could also look at the positioning by house in the composite chart of the lunar node, north node, and that would tell you goals. So where is this relationship headed? What are its common goals? What it really wants to accomplish? And there could be a variety of answers to that question, and the house position of the north node tells you a lot about that. So looking at the way the nodes compare to the other chart, the synastry of the two charts, now you're looking at something very, very important that has a different meaning, which is if somebody's north node is on your sun degree, that is a very positive indication that they really support you. They're believers of what you're up to. And similarly with other planets. So how, especially by conjunction and by opposition, how the north node or the south node would land on your chart from somebody else's chart, anybody else's chart. So you could look at this with a couple relationship, you could look at this with a work relationship too. And you could see, well, their south node lands on my moon, they don't fully value me. There's something about my emotional being that is discounted. And that's not, so positive, especially in a love relationship. So you need to look at those things in the synastry when you're looking at it. So that it's two different ways depending on the technique. And the technique does tell you valuable things in each instance.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind everyone that's here with us on the live video that we ask that your questions remain sort of general in nature rather than very personal, so that the information provided can be helpful and interesting to everyone who's watching. Our next question, actually we have one from a live viewer that's similar to one from our newsletter audience, and it's about the United States chart. So, from Lisa, she asks, I'd like to hear Henry's interpretation on how the current transits are affecting and interplaying with the birth chart of the United States. I haven't heard many people giving readings on it lately. It would be fun to see what the pulse of the nation is as a collective, a group, a family. And Catalina from our Facebook Live audience asks, America's chart with Pluto return in 2021 surely affects us greatly, not necessarily the whole world, but certainly the United States.
And the world.
Henry says, and the world. Does this give the United States a very difficult aspect?
Well, those are good questions. I do welcome that question because I love to work with the U.S. chart, and I haven't been bringing it up lately. I just have been neglecting that. It is an important thing to do. And we knew this question was coming, so we had the USA chart handy with the transits for this particular full moon. And first we're going to look, though, at the natal. So this is the natal chart for the USA, born on July 4th, 1776. I like to use a slightly adjusted chart, which was rectified by actually Dane Rudhyar. There's a book, a fantastic book, called The Astrology of America's Destiny by Dane Rudhyar, and he espouses this chart with 13 degrees Sag and 10 minutes rising. It's a variation on the Sibley chart, which is 5 p.m., 10 minutes, 5:10 p.m. Supposedly this is the timing of the signing. The chart was done very soon after the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence, so this may be when they all signed it. Anyway, that's the chart that's been most useful. Some people use a Gemini rising chart, and really that doesn't match the character of the United States as well as this chart. I mean, people say, for example, that with Sag rising, you have that cowboy atmosphere, that kind of American optimism that's so fundamental to the American character. And, of course, riding horses into the West has been a big factor in this whole country. Anyway, this chart, I'll point out a couple of characteristics while it's being shown as a natal chart, which is easier to see. Namely that Mars is on the descendant of the chart. So there's a certain militarism implied, which is true. I mean, how do we face our enemies, I define them as enemies right there. How do we face other countries across the world? And sometimes it's with military action. The military comes first sometimes instead of the diplomacy. That's always a big question. Diplomacy, by the way, is indicated by the fact that we have also Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in the 7th house. We have a loaded 7th house in this chart. At the time of the World Trade Center attacks in 2001, on September 11th, 2001, Pluto and Saturn were across the axis of this very chart. Pluto was at 12 degrees, and Saturn was at 14, so the midpoint was 13 degrees. They were conjunct that summer, and people were talking about what it was going to be, as what was going to happen in the world with Pluto and Saturn opposite each other, which happens every 37 years or something like that. And then it was right across the axis of this particular chart, so I think it kind of really proved it out. And at that time also, Pluto moved into the first house of the U.S. chart. So subsequent to that 9/11 event, you can say the destiny of America changed. There's been a transformation of America based on that feeling of vulnerability that came with the terrorist attack, which killed so many people, which was a very unusual event, of course. As everybody knows, it hasn't happened much that there's been a fighting on our own soil, and it was a very unusual event in that way. Then, of course, with the Saturn being right here at 14 degrees, if that's right. I think 14 degrees at 9/11. Also, Saturn in the U.S. chart is 14 degrees of Libra. So there's been a lot of associations with that, including the fact that Eris has been sitting around the 20-degree mark all this time, too. And here's Chiron in the U.S. chart at 20 degrees of Aries. So let's go back to the transit. So here we're looking at the transit right now. And, of course, the Sun being at 21 degrees of Aries, Mars being at 21 degrees of a neighboring sign. So that's a sextile of Gemini, which is an air sign. They're similar in that way. And then, of course, Mars in the sky at 22. So it does bring up a sort of a militaristic side of things. And then you can see also that the 21-degree mark of Aries is right on this Chiron. So there's some suffering involved right now in the United States. There was a lot of suffering at the time of 9/11, in part because of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was widely considered by people in this country as a problem. You know, it was an invasion of a sovereign country and a lot of damage was done. I really believe that until there is a universal recognition in this country of the violence of that act and the deliberate nature of that act, which was done on false premises, they really wanted to see if they could get knock over that regime and have access to those vast oil resources of Iraq. That was what was really going on, I believe, and I don't know if everybody rather would agree with that. But that's my take on it, and I really feel like that's one of the great painful places within the United States. The population here recognizes that was not done as a good thing, and so I think we feel the pain of other countries in that way. And of course, there's a lot of pain within this country too, in the income inequality, which creates pain for the lower end of it. So we have some difficulties right now, and it's emphasized by the fact that this full moon comes right across on the Chiron of the U.S. We could say also that the Saturn position that we talked about, conjunct the galactic center, 27 degrees of Sag as it retrogrades here in April of 2017. We have also, at a similar degree of another masculine sign, an air sign, another sextile, in other words, between that transiting position of Saturn and the moon in the U.S., which is the public. So there's quite a few indications of difficulties here at home, and we can see it in the body politic, can we not? I mean, we can see that there's a lot going on, a lot of polarization, a lot of angst, a lot of painful place, to me, associated not only with what's happening here at home, but also with what's happening around the world. You know, a question of how that can be handled better, how there can be less violence, more peaceful solutions. So I think that's kind of part of what's going on. So I guess that's all I want to say right now. Anyway, that's a little bit of an indication for you there.
Great. Would you like to take more questions?
Sure, we can take a few more.
Okay. Renee, who is here with us live, asks, do you have any comment on starting new romantic relationships during this time with the current transits?
Well, that's a good question. You know, the funny thing is, romantic relationships that are started with Venus retrograde, you might think it's a bad idea, but a lot of times they really last. In a way, you're looking back to previous relations and maybe finding a repeat in the current one, which means that you're on a theme and you're doing it over again and you're doing it in a different way this time. So it's not, you would think that Venus retrograde might be a bad time to start a relationship, but I don't think it really is. I think it can be a good time. It can be a very good time to be conscious as you're starting a relationship. In other words, looking very deeply into your own relationship motivations, into that of the person that you're connecting up with. What are the goals? You know, what are you here for? Are you here for the same things that I'm here for? Those questions would be very appropriate. And, you know, like, it's not a guarantee either way. You know, I don't think it's a terrible time. I don't think it necessarily would be a great time. It's always a question mark when that comes around, and you really you benefit from looking inside. You benefit from thinking, what is my inner self telling me? What is my intuition telling me? Doing a little meditating on the situation is always a good idea, and even more so right now. I would say that there's a possibility, and it depends on how the Venus, you would want to see how Venus in 27 degrees of Pisces is really hitting your chart. If you look at that, that would be a clue. The fact that Venus is conjunct Chiron at this time, it's very likely that any relationship that begins now has that flavor of old wounding. And I think oftentimes we connect up with each other based on when we find a person that can accept us all the way down to the bottom, including our flaws, that understands maybe some of the wounds that we've encountered in our early upbringing and is ready to comfort us in that way, or is ready to at least accept us in that way. Well, you've got that, and I see that, but it's not a deal breaker for me. And so that's important to recognize too, that very much so at this time, I think the childhood wounding could be coming up as a factor. And especially so if when you look at your chart, you see that 26, 27 degree mark of Pisces or any of the mutable signs. That would be an indication that that's what this is about. And as always, the recommendation is to go slow. Take it slow and see what develops. Watch and wait, and don't plunge in. So I'd say those are all good indications for this particular timing.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. We have a question from Julia. How much weight does one give to a stellium in a birth chart, especially if it is not in the same sign as the sun's placement?
Well, stelliums are important. They don't have to be in the same sign as the sun. In fact, it gives you another sign, doesn't it? I mean, you have your sun sign, you have your moon sign, you have your ascendant sign. And if you have a stellium in a particular sign, particular house, it's good to pay attention to that. Yes, strong. We can take one more question, I think.
Okay, we got a good one from Ellie. She's with us live. Any comment on the effect of these repeated full moons this year when you are born at 22 or 23 degrees? In her case, it's 23 degrees Cap.
Wow. Yeah, well, I think 23 degrees Cap is your sun degree, I assume. I think it means that you're really having a lot of transformational stuff going on. Especially with Eris, it has to do with finding soul purpose, So I would say with Eris in square to your sun at this time, it's a powerful indicator that you're really kind of trying to grab for deeper meaning in your life. Eris I find to be a warrior energy, a powerful energy for making things happen, for taking a stand for what you most deeply believe, and it has to do with soul intention. So finding a strong Eris aspect, the square to your natal sun degree, I think that's a very powerful time, and you really should be looking at that and seeing if there are changes that you're contemplating that have to do with finding a closer fit with what you most deeply believe, what you want to stand for. What is there inside you that only you bring, that you can get in touch with, and you can say, this is where I need to take action. And it may not have anything to do with what brings you the money. It may have, the best advice, Joseph Campbell once said, the best advice I ever gave somebody in their career search was to ignore money. So that's something to think about. So I guess with that anti-materialistic note, we'll close for now. I'll switch back, I guess, to the face view here. And, I just want to say that in closing, that these are really intense times. And, we can take a victimhood stand and feel like, oh my God, I'm going through so much crap right now. This is terrible. And we can look at the country which is going in certain directions, and we can be thrilled or not thrilled, and we can say, oh, this is terrible, and bemoan the situation or not. But basically when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and that's a very good thing to remember. That we can look at all this stuff as a challenge. It depends on how you really regard your life. Are you looking at your life as just a random collection of actions, and maybe leads to having some money at the end and hopefully accomplish something, and you have your kids and you have your family, or is it more deeper than that? Are we looking at our life as has some purpose to it, has a reason that we came into this life? The challenges that arise, can we look at those as surmountable? Can we see that if we can take the stand that really represents who we are at the deepest level, which is, I believe, the lesson of Eurus, that it's coming into prominence now, that people are starting to recognize in in astrology work. Can we look at our life and say there is a deeper purpose to it? We're here for a reason. And, what is, we have to suss it out. It's not easy to figure that out. So what is that reason? Why are we here? What are these difficulties telling me? If I keep running into an obstacle, what is it telling me? And is there a way that maybe it's telling me to go a different direction? So, these are all indications in our life that can be taken in either a positive or a negative way. And we really benefit when we can assume that the universe is there for us, that there's a purpose to our life, that there's a purpose to the universe, and that everything is evolving just as it should. When we can see things that way, nothing is so very bad. Everything can be handled. And it's a good way to look at things. So I encourage you to think about that in these rather difficult times that we're in the midst of. And best of luck with everything, and talk to you soon. Have a great couple of weeks. Bye now.